Okay, let's talk language. We all use it every single day. But here's a thought. When you think language, does your mind immediately jump to, well, grammar? The rules, the structure, getting things right. It's a pretty common connection people make that language is basically grammar. But we've been digging into these sources you shared with us, materials looking at lingua, which is language, and grammatica, grammar. And honestly, they challenge that idea pretty directly.
They really do. Right off the bat, the core argument we found is crystal clear.
Yeah.
According to these specific sources, language and grammar. They are definitely not the same thing. So our mission today, sticking just to this material, is to unpack why they make that distinction and figure out what language really involves, beyond just the rule book.
Okay, let's unpack that. So the sources suggest this whole language equals grammar idea stems from, well, thinking language only has that one component, grammar. And they say this leads people to sort of judge language skill based almost entirely on sticking to those rules, often against what they call a supposed cultivated norm.
Yeah, and what's interesting is they don't just throw grammar out. They're quite specific about its role. Grammar has a function, they say. It gives us the rules for putting words together, building sentences. It defines the possibilities, the combinations, the order of things. It's like a,
Yeah.
a regulatory function for actually constructing language.
Right. Okay, so it's the framework,
Yeah.
the architecture. But, and this seems important, the sources are very clear that just knowing these rules, the nitty-gritty of grammar word types, how words change form, like plurals or tenses, what they term flexions, how you combine them, the word order, just knowing that stuff isn't enough for really effective communication. Why not?
Well, this is where it gets bigger. The sources argue that language is much more than just a static collection of rules or a system just sitting there. They describe it as an active thing, an interactive social communication activity. It's this complex entity where different subsystems are all integrated and depend on each other.
Okay, so if grammar is only one piece, what are the other parts of this language puzzle, according to the sources? They seem to start with two main ones that are always connected.
Yes, exactly. They present language as built on two core components, and they stress these are in constant interplay. First, there's the lexicon. That's basically the collection of words, your vocabulary. And second, there's grammar, the rules we just talked about for building sentences and words. They even point out grammar includes rules for, like, creating new words or adapting existing ones. Using the lexicon, we have, think, prefixes, suffixes, that sort of thing.
Ah, okay, so grammar's the structure, the blueprint maybe, and the lexicon is the actual stuff, the words that fill the structure and, crucially, carry the meaning. The sources really seem to emphasize the lexicon. Why do they see it as so fundamental?
They call it foundational, absolutely essential. It's tied up with how speakers understand the world around them, even their sense of identity. There's even a quote they use from Milor Fernandez, "What we don't see, language invents,"
Hmm.
which is quite a statement, isn't it?
Yeah, that is powerful.
It suggests words don't just label things. They can actually shape how we perceive reality, maybe even create new ways of seeing. The lexicon is the raw material we use to build texts, to convey what we mean when we interact verbally.
And this is where it gets really interesting for me. The sources bring up the social aspect of the lexicon. They mention how variations in vocabulary, even using words that might be seen as informal or, sometimes stigmatized, can actually have a greater social effect than just making a grammar mistake. And conversely, using certain kinds of specialized vocabulary can bring a lot of prestige.
Exactly right. Which leads to their point that growing your lexicon, expanding your vocabulary, isn't just about knowing more words. It's presented as crucial for boosting your cognitive and communicative range, for being able to express complex thoughts clearly and precisely. They credit Garcia for that insight in the material.
Okay, so we have grammar, the rules, the structure. We have lexicon, the words, the meaning, the social weight. And they're constantly interacting. But the sources add even more to this picture, don't they?
They do. Beyond lexicon and grammar, they list two more key components. Number 3 is text composition. This involves using what they call resources of textualization, essentially. How we actually put language together, organize it into coherent text, whether spoken or written, so it makes sense.
Right, how we build paragraphs or conversations.
Exactly. And number 4 is social interaction situations. This means understanding the context, the social norms, the situation where the language is actually being used. Language, in their view, isn't just a theoretical potential. It's this dynamic system that comes alive in concrete, real-world interactions.
Hmm. And taking this much broader, more dynamic view, That seems to underpin their criticism of how language is often taught. They use the word equivocation, like it's a big misunderstanding, to focus mainly on grammar.
Yes, they're quite critical. The sources explicitly push back against the tendency in language teaching to, overly focus on grammar definitions, classifications, endless drills. They even cite research showing a preference among educators for grammar exercises over activities focused on vocabulary, on the lexicon.
So what's their bottom line on teaching?
It's pretty stark. They conclude that language teaching cannot just be grammar lessons. That approach, they argue, completely misses the big picture. It loses sight of language's totality, ignoring the vital roles of the lexicon, how texts are built, and the social context.
Okay, let's try to sum this up then. Based purely on these sources, thinking language is grammar is, well, it's a really limiting view. Grammar is definitely part of it, the rules, the structure. But the lexicon, the words themselves, is just as important, maybe even more important for meaning, identity, social impact.
Right. And it's not just those two parts in isolation. Language is presented as this whole dynamic system. It includes grammar, lexicon, how we actually compose meaningful text, and how we navigate the social situations where we use it.
So knowing the grammar rules helps you build sentences correctly.
Necessary, yes, but definitely not sufficient for the incredibly rich, complex, sometimes messy business of actual human communication. Really understanding and expanding your vocabulary, appreciating the power and nuance of words, and being tuned into the context, the social dynamics that's vital, according to these sources.
So for you listening, what does this all mean? Maybe it's just a nudge to think a bit differently about how you learn languages, perhaps, or even just how you view communication day to day. Are we maybe sometimes too caught up in correctness based on grammar rules and maybe not paying enough attention to the sheer power, the precision, the social resonance of the actual words we choose and how we put them together?
And that brings up a really thought-provoking question, doesn't it? If language, especially through its lexicon and how we use it in context, is how we make sense of the world, and maybe even, as that quote suggested, how we invent new ways of seeing things, what kinds of possibilities might open up if we shifted our focus a bit, moving beyond just hunting for grammatical errors and instead really exploring the full, vibrant, deeply social potential of language in action. What could that unlock?